Have you ever been with someone who feels emotionally unreachable? Not just in moments of withdrawal or silence, but in a more pervasive way, where the person seems present, may even be engaging, and yet remains strangely out of reach. This experience comes up often in relationships with narcissistically organized individuals. It's something I hear about, and at times experience in my work with these individuals. Being with someone who appears available, even connected at times, but overall remains unreachable. If you yourself have been accused or recognize what I'm referring to, or if someone you're close to feels emotionally unreachable, this may resonate with you. This experience is often linked to what people describe as narcissists living, and I quote, double lives. And I don't mean only dramatic secrets like hidden affairs. I'm also referring to more ordinary, everyday forms of secrecy, hidden accounts, private fantasies, deceptive omissions, internal worlds that remain carefully protected, such as inner conflicts that are never spoken, but are lived through withdrawal, irritability, or subtle punishment. Today, I want to think about these experiences through a psychoanalytic concept that helps make sense of them. This is what John Steiner, a renowned psychoanalyst, called, and I quote, the psychic retreat. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, I want to think more deeply about a particular experience that comes up again and again in relationships with narcissistically organized individuals, the experience of emotional unreachability. Rather than understanding this simply as withdrawal, avoidance, or lack of interest, I want to approach it from a psychoanalytic perspective. This gives us a way to think about how emotional distance, false contact, and double lives are not just manipulative behaviors, but part of a highly organized internal system designed to protect the individual from anxiety, guilt, and psychic pain. My goal today is to help you understand what's actually happening psychologically when you, or someone you may know, seems present but remains out of reach, and why contact itself can feel so threatening. What often happens in these moments, in this way of living, it's not just moments, but it becomes a way of living, is not simply avoidance, but a turning away from emotional contact into, what you turn away is into a more protected internal space. Often, it shows up in the ordinary ways a person organizes their inner and their outer life to keep emotional dependence at a safe distance. So in other words, they do not want to go near any kind of dependency. And once you start listening for how this protection works, you can see that these retreats can take many different forms. Sometimes these retreats take the form of a fantasy, or what we could call a rich internal world. Other times, they organize around work, politics, ideology, pornography, video games, or other pursuits that limit emotional dependence on another person. What matters here is not the content of the retreat, but the function that it serves. That's what I want to speak to you about today. Perhaps the most difficult type of retreat is one that is disguised as contact. It's a sort of false contact. That's what's offered. You're invited to engage, but you can only engage at a superficial level in ways that feel hollow or subtly dishonest. Behind this appearance of connection, you retreat into a powerful system of protective mechanisms that function as a safe refuge. I want you to pause here for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever felt that kind of contact? Or have you ever noticed yourself offering it, that sort of superficial contact that I just described? Let's get right into it. What is a psychic retreat, and how is it different from withdrawal? Steiner uses this term to describe a particular kind of withdrawal, not simply pulling away from others, but retreating into an internal place where contact with other people and with reality can be avoided. It's an area of the mind experienced as relatively safe, protected from anxiety, guilt, and depression. And I'll come back later to this depression when I give a clinical illustration of this. In narcissistically organized individuals, this retreat is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like superiority, arrogance, acting out, or some kind of addiction or perversion. But on a deeper level, what we're often seeing is something else. For example, narcissistic grandiosity, in this sense, is not simply an inflated self-image. It functions as the retreat itself. It's a kind of psychological bunker. This bunker can take many forms: aloof superiority, a mocking dismissal of the other person, or even of me and the therapeutic work itself. In each case, the function is similar: to avoid genuine contact and the vulnerability that contact entails. It provides an area of safety where reality does not have to be faced, where omnipotence can be maintained, and where the individual is protected from feelings that might otherwise feel overwhelming. If this retreat functions as an area of safety, what does it actually look like? Steiner notes that the retreat is often experienced not just as a mental state, but as a place. It may appear as a house, an island, or a kind of secret paradise, something that's set apart from ordinary life. Sometimes this place exists in external reality. In other words, there really may be a house that you like to retreat to, perhaps your parents' home. Or sometimes it exists primarily in the mind. In everyday terms, this can be as ordinary as, and I'm quoting here, the man cave, or what's also referred to as the she shed. The point isn't the setting itself, but the experience of safety. This is the protection from intrusion or from demands and emotional exposure. Now, in other cases, that sense of safety is provided through belonging to a group, sometimes one that functions more like a cult, or through a relationship that promises protection from feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, anxiety, or depression. Whether the retreat is organized through fantasy, a group, or another person, it often becomes the preferred mode of functioning, even when it causes suffering, an attachment, or even an addiction, I should call it, to the retreat can take hold. So despite the suffering, the retreat still has a hold on you. What does it look like when this, and I quote, safe world starts to take priority over real connection? And how does this pattern show up in relationships, especially when stress, loss, or vulnerability hits? This kind of addiction, an addiction to escaping into their safe world, becomes much clearer when we look at how it shows up in relationships. Because remember I said a moment ago, the psychic retreat can be a group, a home, a thing, or even another person. To see how this plays out in real life, let's consider an example from a recent interview that I did. It illustrates what it looks like when someone turns to a psychic retreat, or, more broadly, a temporary internal haven in the midst of profound loss and vulnerability. For those of you who have been following this podcast, you might remember a recent interview I did with a woman who lost everything. If you want to go back to that, that was episode 120 and 122, if you want to check it out. This was a woman who entered a relationship at a moment of profound psychic and emotional depletion. In her earlier childhood, she told me, she had spent decades in a gaslighting, triangulating family system where she was scapegoated and emotionally starved. She managed to escape that traumatic family environment. She married. And my sense of it was that she finally felt held, contained, supported, and seen, perhaps for the first time in her life. She had managed to build some stability in her life, and then suddenly she was widowed. This was a devastating loss of identity and belonging. What happened is she described it in great detail. There was a rapid collapse of both the inner and external structures that held her together, her marriage, her professional role, and her children leaving home. She was again lost, and I say again because this experience echoed familiar feelings from childhood. Her sense of self was fractured, and she became highly susceptible to idealization and rescue fantasies, turning quickly to what might look like a psychic refuge or temporary internal haven where safety and cohesion could be experienced. The loss of her husband didn't simply create sadness and mourning, it destabilized her internal structure. When she lost the other, that's her husband, who helped organize herself, what we saw was a collapse, and this is what can occur. So when the other person helps organize the sense of self and there's a loss, what typically follows is a collapse. In that state, the psyche faces a fork. It can begin the long process of mourning and rebuilding. Remember earlier I said depression. Remember I said the psychic retreat is to avoid depression. This is part of it. Mourning and rebuilding. Or it becomes hungry, craving anyone who can recreate the sense of safety, orientation, and emotional holding it once depended on so deeply. When you place that developmental history alongside the emotional collapse she experienced after her husband's death, you can see how primed she was to seek out a, and I quote, fantasy-based refuge in another person. Remember I said this can happen with another person. And this is exactly what we've been calling a psychic retreat, a temporary haven the psyche creates when emotional safety and cohesion collapse. What most people would register as dangerous, manipulation, inconsistency, emotional volatility felt compelling to her in this relationship because, in that moment, the fantasy of safety and cohesion in the retreat temporarily outweighed the demands and reality of the external world. Again, that was the relationship and the man she had chosen. Now, initially, when he idealized her, rushing intimacy, what she called, and I quote, future faking. He future faked a commitment, placing her on a pedestal. It wasn't just flattering. It activated a deep longing for affirmation and repair. Psychodynamically, his attention offered a temporary internal safe space, restoring a sense of self-cohesion fractured by both childhood wounds on the one hand and the recent devastating loss of her husband. But she knew something was wrong. She saw the red flags, hired a private investigator very early on, and she noticed the inconsistencies, yet she stayed. Why? Because the emotional need to avoid unbearable aloneness overpowered her internal alarm system. In other words, the pull of this temporary internal haven, again, that's the retreat, the psychic retreat, outweighed the reality. She held on to the fantasy rather than the facts. Relating this back to the main theme of today's episode, she was alone, vulnerable, and unanchored. This might be precisely the moments when you depend on these internal and external structures, that's the psychic retreats, to protect you from primitive states of fragmentation, anxiety, and again, even depression. There's an intense fear that emerging from the retreat would overwhelm you or unbearable anxiety. And again, that's a fear, may not necessarily be a reality, something that she and I teased apart in this interview. The retreat provides a space where reality does not have to be faced, where fantasy and omnipotence can exist unchecked, and where anything is permitted. Again, if you listen back to the interview, you will hear her grappling with the question, how do we get back to the beginning of the relationship when everything was great? In other words, the trauma bond, if I can call it that, or the sadomasochistic type of relationship, or even the creation of, and I quote, a paradise. This happens with some men, for example. This could be in pornography, drinking, drugs, or other compulsive outlets. The main purpose is that it all serves to bind, to neutralize, and control primitive anxieties and destructive impulses. So now we've seen how the psychic retreat functions, why it emerges, and what it protects. The next question is, how can therapy help someone gradually emerge from this internal haven? Recognizing the retreat opens the door to healing. In my work with these individuals, once the retreat is noticed, the goal isn't to attack, dismantle it, or try to break it down. It's part of their reality. It's part of your reality, something that's helped you survive. The first step is simply seeing it for what it is, and then slowly, over time, its grip will begin to loosen. A big part of treatment is helping the person understand how they create the retreat and what it does for them. When is it most appealing? When do they turn to it? How does it make them feel safe? See, in other words, the goal, of course, as I always say, is to get close to your subjective experience and the usefulness of the retreat. By exploring these questions together, they can begin to see the retreat as a coping strategy rather than something that completely controls them. As we work through this, small moments of real contact start to happen, and they always do. I'm saying this even with someone who has this narcissistic organization, there are always small moments of real contact. When the person senses that someone truly understands the fear, the anxiety, and the pull of the retreat, and doesn't threaten it, by the way, by telling them they have to give it up and giving them an ultimatum, they begin to feel supported rather than threatened. And that support allows them to experiment with connection and reality in small, tolerable steps without immediately retreating back into fantasy or isolation. This process takes time and patience. Eventually, the person begins to realize that they don't have to rely on a retreat or on other unhealthy substitutes for safety and comfort. The retreat loses its addictive hold, and they can face life more fully, experiencing vulnerability, connection, and the world itself in a way that once felt impossible. We've spent some time today exploring psychic retreats, how they show up, what they protect, and how they can feel so compelling even when they keep someone out of real contact. From the fantasy worlds and internal havens to the ways these retreats can appear in relationships, we've seen how the psyche creates safety when life feels overwhelming. I hope today's discussion has helped you see these patterns more clearly. As always, thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.